Look, very much like to thank AUSVEG for the opportunity to speak. When I was asked to speak, I had a bit of a think about what I'd like to talk about. Really, I'm not here to hypothesise about what we could do or what's all possible. We've been doing a pretty good trade in the last few years, and I'd just like to share the citrus industry experience about where we've come from, where we are today, where we'd like to go. But hopefully that might be able to inform some of AUSVEG's their investment and their activities over the next few years, also Hort Innovations investment with your R&D levies and you yourselves as well. We've got some slides here, beautiful. Okay, just a very quick snapshot of the industry. We've got about 1,500 growers that grow on about 25,000 hectares of land. We conduct a tree census every year, so we've got pretty accurate figures on that. Producing around the 700 to 750,000 tonnes per annum on average. Last year was a bigger year, closer to 800. Interesting statistic there, 28% of the business farming on 79% of the land, a bit like 10% of the fishermen catching 90% of the fish. As a rule of thumb, about a third gets processed into juice, a third gets sold on the domestic market here in Australia as fresh fruit, and a third goes to export to over 50 destinations. Record volumes, we just seem to set a record every year in the last 5 years. Volume last year, 272,000 tonnes went in 2017 to a value of 462 million. So we set a fairly ambitious target a few years ago, and we did think it was rather ambitious. We said we'd like to see exports reach $500 million by 2025. So we're way ahead of any expectation we ourselves even set. Look, nothing new there. We attract a very high premium in overseas markets. There's no doubt about it. Australian citrus is the best colour and has the best sweetness of any fruit in the world. Our reputation for green, clean, healthy and food safety is what sells our fruit. And I think on the back of tourism campaigns, those sort of images are what overseas people think of when they think of Australia, and that's had flow-on effects to our fruit. 1970s, nothing says the 70s like a bad haircut. Look, going back, we had a very sheltered market, very protected market, and focused very much on the domestic market here, and very, very big focus during the 70s and prior on the juice offerings there. We had large plantings of Valencia oranges grown largely for juice. There was only ever really niche export opportunities into Europe. And then with around the Whitlam government, tariffs started to be removed. We saw economic reform and tariffs were slowly coming off. We saw the entry of imported juice and imported juice products and concentrates, and we saw declining returns for juice. Move ahead into the 90s, the haircuts didn't improve, but we got access to the USA for South Australia just for one state in 1992, and the Riversun Export Company was born. We saw increased plantings in navels, and later on that same decade, about 5 years later, we saw access for New South Wales and Victoria as well. Around that time we got access to Japan, but there was a heavy focus on access to on exports to the US through the Riversun Export Company, and quite a unique story there. Just to talk about why the Riversun Export Company, so probably a great Australian success story. We've never seen this since or before probably. We saw 24 exporting shareholders come together to coordinate shipping. As you can see there, back then there was no containerised shipping. This was charter vessels. That is a God's honest photo taken by my previous boss. We literally loaded entire vessels with citrus and sent them on their way to the USA. So no single grower had enough fruit to fill an entire vessel, so I suppose the Riversun Export Company was born out of necessity. And with that came good quality control procedures, efficiency with full reefer vessels, consistency of quality, big one, reliability, massive sort of volumes, there were no excuses. And the Riversun Company assisted promotions at the other end, saw really, really good returns for growers. So this got the industry on its feet with the exports. So really the first signs of success, this is what's going on in the US. So there was no Southern Hemisphere competition, we were it. So we had Californian citrus in their season and we filled that market in the counter season. Really favourable exchange rates, we'll see that in a moment. Single exporter, single importer, really competitive rates on freight. And the three southern areas were largely fruit fly free, so we had an advantage there as well. So there you sort of see the picture there. We humble beginnings around the 5,000 tonne mark in the mid-90s, hitting its peak around 2007 to around the 35,000 tonne mark per annum, but we can see it declining thereafter. And we can sort of see why in the next slide. I said a moment ago we had some very favourable exchange rates. So these were glory days. You know, people still talk about them today. We had really good exchange rates, and even there you can see exchange rates of sort of 50 to 55 cents to the dollar. So what that meant, fruit went overseas, it got sold, and when they brought their money back, they basically doubled their money at times. Wind the clock forward a bit, you can see there in the 2010-2011, David McKinnon mentioned it earlier, we hit parity and we even hit $1.10 at some point, so that was a disaster. Also what happened in 1997, South Africa entered the market and got market access. Didn't do us much harm. They supplied the east coast of the US, where we focused on the west coast. I don't know if you could say there was a gentleman's arrangement, but it just worked quite well. Chile got access around 2006, 2007, but really didn't enter the market seriously till 2009. So the perfect storm was really brewing. Chile's now entered the market, close proximity, massive volumes of fruit, and the dollar's now reaching parity. What that meant for us is, we really lost market share. So this is what Chile did. They got into the market, their first serious year of trade, 20,000 tonnes, virtually doubled next year and so on. So 2016, they're doing over 60,000 tonnes. Doesn't show it there. It's 2017, they're doing around 70,000 tonnes of oranges alone, not mandarins and lemons. This is quite an interesting slide. I just have to remind myself what it actually is. So exports to Japan from Chile. This is a really interesting slide. Really, this is the success story I'm talking about. You can see early part of this century, and 2001, 2000 mark, you can see Chile and Australia really jostling for market share in Japan there. And by 2005 or 2006, we're really starting to push them out. Bear in mind, they haven't really hit the US just yet, so we're really pushing them out on quality. As I said before, we are, reliable supply, really sweet and good coloured citrus, and they really, really struggle on supplying citrus of the same quality we had. So about 2009, we virtually pushed them out of Japan. They've cleared out of Japan. They're heading to the US. We saw on the previous slide, and it's all systems go for us. To the point last year, we exported over 40,000 tonnes to Japan. So it's been growing ever since. We did think it sort of reached its peak a few years ago, but it's gone up and down a little bit, but it looks like the overall pattern is still going forward. Different story for Chile. So once they got access to the USA, they're basically throwing everything they've got at the USA and backed right out of Japan, and really pushed out of Japan based on quality by us. So we're facing reality, come back a bit. 2017, success is fading. Chile is really, really competitive in the US market. The dollar's at parity or even worse for us. We're still recovering from drought. 2011, we still talk about it as a year that is best forgotten. Heavy on crop, really small fruit, no one wanted it. Very poor returns for juice. Dollar was $1.10 US. Massive plantings of mid-season navels marked for the US, but no one really wanted them. But we are showing positive signs in Asia, particularly Japan at that point. So we had to do something else, really focusing on Asia. I don't know if you can read that. Yeah, you should be able to read that from there. It's a little bit of a convoluted way of saying that more than half the world's population lives in that circle there. Right on our doorstep, got a rapidly expanding middle class. Their populations are moving into the cities, which really favours our modern style of trade in supermarkets. Many of these countries, particularly China, don't trust their own food supply. Whereas in Australia, we look at imported food as something that's bad. These people overseas in Asia see imported food as a luxury item, and they're willing to pay a high premium for that. So we no longer have to rely on the US or Europe, which is our historic markets. We're now really focused there on Asia. And I would say China, what we were saying 5 years ago is China is perhaps the biggest opportunity that our industry has ever seen, and most likely to be the biggest opportunity they will ever see in their entire lives. So the present is, 273,000 tonnes last year, and that was growth on the previous season by 20%. We talk in tonnes. Other analysts can stand up here and talk about value. It's very difficult, at what point in the supply chain do we measure value? When the currency changes from year to year, it doesn't put a sort of a reliable measure on it, so we always talk in tonnes. So 20% improvement on the volume from the previous year. As I said, the value was close to $500 million. China's gone from nothing just in 2012 to 70,000 tonnes last year, and we're seeing almost exponential growth in that market. Japan, another strong performer at 42,000 tonnes, and Hong Kong still very strong at 31,000. The remarkable thing there is if we look at Greater China or Hong Kong, China and Taiwan put together, we're doing well over 100,000 tonnes, more than a third of our export volume going into one single market. So that's both a good and a bad thing. We're, heavily reliant on China, and things can go wrong quite easily. So just a snapshot of what we're actually exporting. So the vast majority is oranges. As a rule of thumb, about 3/4 of our product goes offshore is oranges, valued at around 300 million and just under 200,000 tonnes. Mandarin's about 1/4 of our crop, 70,000 tonnes and 144 million. Lemons, lime and grapefruit, fairly negligible at this point, really only around 4,400 tonnes, but a respectable sort of value there. So this is showing where our exports went last year. China taking the lion's share, as I said a moment ago. Japan and Hong Kong very strong, but if we look at the next, so 91% of the trade goes into just a handful of markets, a dozen or so markets. As I said, we export to over 50 markets, but really only 12 capture the lion's share there. This one's a little bit interesting, just shows the growth on the previous year's exports. So China grew at 78% on the previous year. Japan's continued to grow at 14%, Hong Kong 5%. This is all citrus combined. And if we just look at oranges on their own, it's a little bit different. I think the important thing is I'd rather look at the negatives, or where we haven't seen growth or where we've seen decline. We've seen decline in the UAE, Singapore, USA, New Zealand, Canada. These are all really strong performing markets for us. So this isn't lack of demand in overseas markets. This just, we do not have enough fruit to meet that demand. Okay, so China. This again just shows our picture from China. So I started with Citrus Australia in 2012, and back then it was really just a handful of containers going. We've put a lot of work into developing that market and assisting our export sector in accessing that market and understanding the regulatory arrangements. So almost, if we could draw a sort of a line of best fit there, we could almost see a doubling every year, or exponential growth, to last year where we hit the 70,000 tonne mark, where we never would have expected that. In 2012 we had a little mantra going. We had a grant from Austrade, and the mantra in that project was 20,000 tonnes to China by 2020. So we've well and truly tripled that and more. Another funny photo, it never stops being funny. So there's a lot of people in China. We've had access. Really just repeating what I said just a moment ago. But look, we had access since 2006, and we hadn't really started capitalising on that trade till 2013. We had very difficult quarantine conditions, which were almost unachievable. Challenging market conditions, very difficult to get paid. Credit insurance was impossible back in those days. The industry really struggled to actually understand all the regulatory requirements, so some critical support was needed from us to help our growers, packers and exporters understand what that was all about. So the first thing we did, we developed an instructional manual. All orchards and packing houses have to be registered and meet certain requirements to export to China, and it was all a load of voodoo to them. To be honest, they all thought it was a load of nonsense, and it sort of is a load of nonsense, but we needed to document that nonsense so they could all understand and fulfill it and achieve their audit requirements. So we put that together over the first year in 2013, so the growers understood the cultural practice and all the pest and disease, pest control measures and the packing house procedures. Export registration was a real drama for the first couple of years. As part of those requirements, the Department of Agriculture has to register and audit and send lists to China about all the registered export establishments, growers and packers. In those days, they were running a paper-based system, which was less than a success, I suppose, is the only way to say it. So we took over that process and developed an online way of all our growers registering their blocks and packing houses. Well, there's a picture of it there. So today we've got over 550 growers, 80 packing houses, and that totals 8,500 hectares registered for the China program. So it's inconceivable to think that the old paper-based snail mail system that the department was operating could possibly cope with that sort of demand. In fact, in 2013, when we kicked this program off, we actually missed 6 weeks of our season waiting for regulatory approval from our own government. So obviously something needed to be done, and obviously the online option was the only way to go. So yeah, another thing we've found important over the years is market intelligence. We have crop estimates committees in each of our regions. So we meet with the major packers, and we can sort of, I suppose, sanity check what the other measures we're doing. So we have fruit density surveys and frame counts in all our regions, and we can sort of sanity check those with the packers based on what they can see anecdotally. We have our online tree census, as it says there, I said earlier, so we do a tree census every year. We believe we've probably picked up about 95% of the plantings we have. We're pretty sure there's no other 1,000-hectare orchards out there that we don't know about that aren't visible on Google Earth. So we pick up most of those. From there we can do pretty good crop forecasts and also long-term forecasting over the next decade or so. We collate weekly shipping volumes for all our major shippers. They report to us on a Friday what containers they have in the water, just so we have a basic understanding of what's on the water to key markets like Japan, China and the USA. Again, it's not perfect, we don't pick it all up, but we're pretty certain a big submarine isn't going to come up out of the water. And the other really important one is we have very good relationships with our Southern Hemisphere competitors. So we've got a pretty good idea on what's on the water into Shanghai, for instance, from South Africa. Just these are some of the sort of groovy sort of modelling we can do out of our tree census, so we know where we are today. Based on the tree age, trees get old, they'll conk out, they'll become unproductive, but new ones become more productive. We understand what trees are in the nursery system. So we've built a model that we can reasonably predict what's going on with our plantings over the next decade or so. So, in the case of mandarins here, we're seeing aphoras go from around the 60,000 tonne mark, potentially to 90,000 tonnes in the next 9 or 10 years. So we know where we can focus our resources. Similar sort of story with our navel oranges. Surprisingly, this is where the demand is. And so earlies and mids are in decline and late. So this is where the demand is, but our industry has responded to this. We've presented this sort of information at forums much like this one, and the industry has responded. To the best of my knowledge, we cannot buy a tree for the next two or 3 years in the nursery system. So it's good to see that information's actually being used. Probably less important for us, we tend to let the exporters and the trade do their own thing. We're not really involved in market activities and promotions and things like that. We certainly think that's the business of the traders, but we have formed exporter groups. I'm careful how I pitch this. We have a bunch of exporters come together as a group to calibrate, to discuss market signals in export markets. I'm very careful about what I say because we do not discuss anything which may impact on pricing or volume on the domestic market. So we are allowed under ACCC laws to come together and discuss things, pricing and signals in export markets, but we do not discuss the domestic market at all. We conduct trade seminars overseas, and we participate in sort of priority trade shows where necessary. We're involved in the setting of quality standards as well, and we do quality testing in all our markets here in Australia, at our wholesale markets, and we've set those quality standards based on sensory evaluations in the marketplace. We can do maturity testing and prediction, developing a program where growers have to pass the product before they actually pick it, and that's feeding into something we call our Sweeter Citrus program. Something else we've really been keen to explore, but very difficult to explore. I'm getting the nod here to wind up. So we have we're thinking about an ultra-low residue concept where we can deliver fruit to market with zero or ultra-low residues. It's not inconceivable. The New Zealand apple industry and kiwi industries have done it before. That's something we're very interested in doing. We run an agrochemical residue monitoring program. It got touched on this morning. We see it as one of our most important issues. We've actually had trade suspended in Japan momentarily for an MRL breach, so we see that as incredibly important. And we partnered with the Australian government about 8 years ago to develop that program. And food safety, as it was spoken about a moment ago, I'm on the board of Fresh Care, see something that is incredibly important. We're seeing some sort of sweeping reforms both in the domestic market here, but we're certainly seeing that have flow-on, or not flow-on effects, we're certainly seeing that come into our export markets as well, both from the retailers and the regulators. Few disappointments, hasn't all been roses. South Korea, we heard about a free trade agreement. We've failed to hit our straps in that market, yet it's the biggest market for imported citrus in the world. We struggle to supply more than 1,000 tonnes. Indonesia should be a very good market for us, could easily be a 30,000 tonne market, but because of Indonesia's regulations and quota systems, we virtually get zero quotas in the best part of our season. Won't really talk about the others, but there are some disappointments there. Certainly some risks for us. Phytosanitary breaches is the big one. MRL violations, food safety risks, political risks. In China, we're heavily leveraged in China, heavily exposed to risk there. As I said, over 100,000 tonnes of trade going there, and only takes a small political incident, we can close that trade, and we're looking for a home for 100,000 tonnes of fruit. And of course, currency fluctuations play a big part. Just very quickly, take-home message is all about quality, 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 and we're very much about growing to market requirements. We're not saying grow more fruit, we're saying find out what the market wants, and we're trying to do supply more with what hectares we have. Anyone can sell the Scotch fillet, but you need to sell the hamburger mince as well. That's, goes without saying. Cooperation between business or like-minded business is really important. Success is really difficult to predict. We made some sort of what we thought were some outrageous predictions, and we fell short in a pretty big way. But above all, have a sense of humour. It's pretty frustrating and irritating when we're dealing with regulators both here in Australia or overseas, and all we can do is take it in our stride in good humour and have a bit of a laugh about it and enjoy ourselves. So thanks once again for the opportunity to speak. I'll be around for a while for any questions.
Thanks, David. Just before you do run off the stage, thank you for sharing that story. And yeah, you will be around for questions for anyone, if anyone's got them afterwards. When you came here, obviously it's a different audience. What's kind of the key takeaway message or the thing you wanted to get across that meets this audience?
I think that last slide was it. Really about you've got to sell the whole crop. There's a lot of excitement about China at the moment, for instance, in our industry and in a lot of industries where, as I said, China takes 70,000 tonnes out of a 700,000 tonne crop. Now, the logical thing to do is to say we'll go out and grow more fruit, but then we grow a bit more for China, but then we get a lot more of the stuff that we don't want as well. So really important to actually have markets for all our crop. That's why for us, markets like Vietnam, the Philippines, all those little second-tier markets are really, really important because they take the sizes and the grades that perhaps China, the US, Korea, Japan don't want. Thank you.